Hi, Assalamu alaikum and very good morning. Sampling is one of the most misunderstood area in business and social science research. There are a lot of gray areas. Through my experience of attending final viva session, proposal defense as chairperson, and also supervising postdoctoral and PhD scholars, I have observed that students have a lot of misunderstanding on the concept of sampling, the selection of appropriate sample or sampling method, determination of sample size. I have observed many students have selected wrong selection method, sampling method for their study. And sometimes they used, say for example, random sampling, but they have written in the draft, they use systematic sampling. Sometimes they use convenience sampling, but they say they use random sampling. And sometimes they use multi-stage sampling, but in the draft, they say they use random sampling. So there's a lot of misunderstanding on the type of sampling methods available and the appropriateness of selection of sampling methods. I have seen students also having misunderstanding on the sample size determination. Students often refer to Christian Morgan or Uma Sakaran table. And based on that, in the draft, we see they have specifically mentioned the minimum sample size required is 384. And then there was a session I was sharing, and then I found the student has exactly 384 respondents. So I asked the student, how did you get exactly 384? How many questionnaires did you distribute? The student told me, sir, I have distributed about 400 and I got back 384. I said, that is very surprising and it is very hard to believe. And if you receive 384, there could be a few questionnaire which was not filled in properly. Or there could be some incomplete filling in of questionnaires. And when you filter a questionnaire, you may even see that some respondents misunderstood the statement and given wrong answers. So we got to filter. So you cannot have exactly 384. Number two, I see students specifically mention they need minimum 384. And then last week, I had to chair a Viva session where I found a master's student had respondents from 97 respondents only. So I asked the student, in chapter 3, you mentioned you need minimum sample size of 384. And then now in chapter 4, you have only 97. So how did you get that? He said, I have distributed 384 and I managed to get back 97. Then I said, then you are not fulfilling the minimum requirement of the sample population that you have for your study. So what should you do with this student? I told the student basically, you failed in this conversation. But again, I don't prefer to fail you. What you can do, you have to refer to a different sample size determination method, probably G power, or the formula of number of variables multiplied 10 plus number of items. Go and find out the citation. So it's not only students. There are supervisors also not very clear about the right kind of sampling method to be selected and the appropriate sample size for a specific study. So today I would like to share in detail of sampling method, the process of sampling, sample or sampling data size determination method, so that it is clearly understood by a student as well as some other academicians. Let me share some slides and then we discuss from there would be easier. So this is the topic that I'm going to discuss today: sampling, misunderstanding, and controversies. So, grow like a sampling with silence, but die like a tree with a great impact. This is what is very important for us to know. Sample is a small part of total population. So when you do research, the whole sample population, in the total population, may not be aware that a kind of research is taking place. But at the end, the impact is very great because we will generalize the findings based on the small sample size of the total population. So research is definitely representative of a total sample population. We cannot take the total population in the sample. We take a small part of it, and that represents the whole population. So you have to be very scientific, systematic, and critical in selecting the sampling methods available for us. So that's what I'm going to cover in today's presentation: why you choose sampling, critical understanding about different sampling methods, the uses of probability and non-probability sampling, determination of appropriate sampling methods, a sampling size, and definitely the misunderstanding and controversy surrounding the sampling will be covered in the first 4 together. So in a business or social science research, these are the components that we have. We start with a research problem, then we translate research problem into research questions and research objectives. Then we'll have guided theories, assumptions. We will review literatures to find out appropriate variables, research gaps for study. And then we develop a theoretical framework. From there, we will construct hypotheses. We'll have operation definition of variable, measurement of variables. We'll have research design and methodology. Then we'll proceed to instrumentations. And that's now where the sampling comes in. So sampling comes only after we have finalized our questionnaire or survey or in-depth interview or focus group. Now, sampling basically is selecting several elements from a population. So we can make an inference about the entire population. So the important area of it would be the representativeness of the sample. So we have to be very careful and systematic in selecting sampling method and the number of samples so that it represents the whole population. So sampling is selection of a subset of individuals from within a statistical population. That's what we are saying. So when we buy, say for example, a piece of, when we buy an apple or orange, the shopkeeper or the food stall may not give you the whole piece of an orange. They might just give you a slice of it and let you taste. And we taste it, and if you like it, we decide to buy more. But how do you know the orange that you have tasted is having the same taste as the rest of the oranges? But again, we will make a conclusion on a simple, small piece, and we'll buy it. Even when you go to buy lychee, for example, We'll be given a small piece of lychee, one piece of lychee, and then we taste it. If you like it, we'll buy a few hundreds. So how do you know that one piece of lychee given to you and you have tasted it nice? How do you know that the rest of the lychees are good? But somehow in our life, we have to conclude based on a small size of population. Okay, so one piece of lychee is enough for you to conclude the rest of the lychees. So it may not be right, but yet we have to make a decision. The same thing goes to the research. When you do research, we have millions of populations in certain study. We cannot be collecting data from millions of population. So we have to get a small part of population. That's basically the idea of sampling. Why you do sampling? Because of pragmatic reasons. We have budget constraint and time constraints. We have little time. For PhD, you have about 3 years time. And we do have budget constraints also, because distribution and collection of data require a lot of money, a lot of time. And sometimes we may not have access to the total population. Sometimes it could be because of remote areas, and sometimes it could be because of having restricted access to certain premises. Also, when you choose sampling method, we tend to have more accurate information, because the whole population that we have for a study, they may not be properly educated, familiar with the area of research. Thus, when you give questionnaire to everyone, many of the questionnaires feeling may not be appropriate for us to analyze those data collected from those questionnaires. And also, when we have strong similarities of population, make sampling easier. If I can collect data from 10 and can generalize on 1,000, why should I collect from 1,000? Say for a classroom, if you have 100 students, if you just get the data from 10 students, some very good ones, some good ones, some medium, some weak students, and that 10 students finding can be representative of 100, then why should you collect data from 100? So that's what we are talking about. You are having accurate and reliable data because your selection of sample is appropriate. And definitely, when you go for census, as we say, people's education level, exposure, understanding would be different. So sampling selection method helps you to collect data from the most appropriate people, and definitely helps you to distract the test unit because you're using a small sample unit. So it saves a cost of research and definitely the time, as we mentioned earlier. There are certain sampling terminologies which are very critical for us to understand before even we proceed to do select sampling method. Sample is a subset or some part of a larger population, and we say it is smaller and hopefully representative, smaller collection of units, but it got to be representative. That is very important for us to remember. The population, when a complete group of entities that share some common set of characteristics. Say, for example, if you are doing a study on customer satisfaction on mobile phones, then we know the character that is similar is that everybody uses mobile phone. If you are doing a survey on job satisfaction of a particular company, we know these people are working in the same company. So certain characteristics got to be common. And from there, we will go and select the sample. Population element is an individual of a population. Census, certain study, the sample size may not be big. And we can choose the whole total population for the study. And that's what we call census. Okay, but when you take part of it, then it becomes the sample. This is another very important one that we got to understood, that we got to be understood. A list of elements from a sample may be drawn, also called as working population. That is what we call sampling frame. Let me give you an example. Say, for example, if you are doing a study on student satisfaction of your university, so the total number of students would be your total population for your study. And then you have decided that you will only collect the data from undergraduate students. Then your sampling frame is going to be undergraduate students only. And from there, we decide which method to employ, and then you will select the sample populations. This is how it works. So who do you want to generalize? That is your theoretical population. What population can you get access to? That is your study population. How can you get access to them? That is your sampling frame. And who is your study? That is the sample. This is another way of showing the idea of sampling. You have target population, then from there you decide on your study population, then you select your sample. This is another way of showing it. You have target population, from there you decide on your sampling frame. And sampling frame, you decide on your sample, actual study units for your study. Now, while we talk about sample, this is something also very important that you got to remember. In a problem, research problem definition, we do also identify the unit of analysis, which is very important. In our sample, individual unit could be individual, it could be households, it could be organization, it could be department, it could be geographical areas, it could be even objects. So this is very, very important. I have asked the student during Viva Voce, what is your unit of analysis? And many students seems to be hearing for the first time when I ask the question. You got to be very familiar with it. It is the unit that you analyze. So if your unit of analysis is individual, so you are collecting data from individual. If your unit of analysis is organization, then you'll be collecting data that represent the whole organization. And it does have implication on the kind of sampling method that we choose. These are the stages of selection of a sample. It starts with defining the target population, selecting sampling frame. Then we determine whether we'd like to use probability or non-probability sampling methods. Then we plan procedure for selecting sampling units. We'll determine the sample size. Then we select the actual sampling units and followed by distribution of questionnaire. So as I gave you example before, if you're doing a study on, say for example, student satisfaction on online classes in Malaysia, for example, then all the students who have been attending online classes are your target population or theoretical population. And then when you decide, say for example, I would like to get the data only from private universities, that become your target population. And then you said, okay, I want to take one from research university, one from comprehensive university, one from technical university, one from teaching university. So we are selecting now 4 or 5 universities that become your sampling frame. And then we decide which sampling method to be used. And then we continue the rest of the stages of selection of sample process. This is the sampling process, a typical sampling process that is used by a researcher. They start with defining population of concern, as we understood, specifying sampling frame, specifying sampling method, determining sample size, implementing sampling plan. Then we do sampling and data collection. All right, so this is similar of the last slide, but this is more clear. Stage by stage description of sampling process. Now, sampling method, we have 2 types of sampling methods available. Number 1, you call it probability or random sampling. That's where we have 6 sampling method available, and I'm going to have discussion on each and every one. Number two, non-probability sample, or non-probability or non-random sampling. We do have 5 sampling method here that I'm going to discuss. Now, we have to be very careful here. When should we use probability sampling? And when should we use non-probability sampling? If you need strong generalization from your study findings, then we'll choose probability sampling. If generalization is not really warranted, then we might proceed to non-probability sampling. Number 2, which is very important, if you are choosing random samples or probability samples, then you must obtain the total list of target population. If you cannot obtain the list of target population, then you should proceed to non-probability sampling. So these 2 prerequisites got to be understood and remember when you select appropriate sampling methods. So now we have 6 random sampling and we have 5 non-random sampling. So 11 sampling methods. So obviously, you'll be thinking which one to use, which one is more appropriate for my specific research that I'm undertaking now. Let's start with probability sampling. So we say probability sampling basically where every theoretical population has equal chance to be selected. Okay. So when every element of population does have same probability of selection, that's what we say, equal probability of selection. Everyone has equal chance to be selected. So the methods under this definitely requires you to obtain the list of total target population. So the first one, simple random sampling, and to me this is the most misunderstood sampling method. Students will feel, I collect data just randomly, and so it is random sampling, which is not true. In simple random sampling, the first condition that you need to have is you need to obtain the list of total target population. So this sampling method is applicable when population is small, homogeneous, and readily available. Meaning the population, target population size is small. The population characteristics basically similar, homogeneous, and the list of respondents is available. Then we will use this method. So what we do when we have the list of target population, from the lists, we choose randomly, and then we distribute questionnaire to the selected people from the list that we have obtained. For example, if you go to a supermarket, many times you would see they will ask you to fill up a form because they are going to have a lottery. So when you fill up the form, basically they already have the list of total population participating in the lottery. And then they take it randomly from there, select randomly from there. So they have the list of respondents. So if you are doing a study on student satisfaction of university, you have to obtain the list of students. And from their list, you would tick, these are the ones I'm going to take. So everyone has equals and nobody knows who is going to be selected. You do not know the target population. So biasness is not there. But again, the sample size got to be small. So generalization would be easier. So the sample that you choose should be representative depending on the size of the sample that we are going to discuss later. So sample or simple random sampling may not be appropriate when your sampling frame is large. This method could be impractical because you may not be able to obtain the list of respondents, list of total target populations. And also when you have big population, the minor subgroups would be somehow not represented in the sample that you are choosing. The next one is systematic sampling method under the probability sampling methods. And we must remember and use it when you choose this method. First of all, we need to have the list of respondents. And there's a requirement for us to generalize the findings. So when you obtain the list of target population, from there you choose them systematically. For example, like we choose 5, 10, 50, 20. So you have equal interval in between the list of populations. However, the most misunderstood area of this sampling method is we start with 1. So 1, say for example, we are having an interval of 7. So 1, 7, 14, 21, which cannot be done. You cannot choose number 1. Then it is known that number 1 is going to be selected. So even though we have equal interval in between the selection, we cannot start with 1. It has to be started with the next ones. So say for example, if you select 10th number from the list, then it starts with 10, not from 1. 10, 20, 30, 40. So you have a system of selecting people with a scientific, systematic process. That's what we call systematic sampling. Number 3 is stratified sampling. There's also under probability or random sampling, where I say a population embraces a number of distinct categories in a sampling frame, which is organized in a separate strata. When we have population, target population available, the list is available. From there, we'll make sure we choose respondents based on a strata, for example, like male and female. We'll collect the statistics about male and female. If we find that in our country, 50% male and 50% male, then we got to make sure we have 50% male and 50% female in our data before we analyze. Or if you are doing a study of student satisfaction of university, then we have to look at the total population and see what percentage of female student there and what percent of male student there. And we have to make sure that representative nature is there because we would like to generalize the findings. Then we might proceed to choose strata sampling or stratified sampling method. For this method, we will ensure that every minority group or strata is selected in the sample. This is how it looks like. Similar, homogeneous one will have one group. So we have different groups, and from those groups, we decide to select the population. Now, when you go for stratified sampling, it could be proportional, it could be non-proportional. That's what I was mentioning earlier. If you have 50% male and female, then you got to have that representative nature of it. That's what you call proportional. It could be disproportional also. So when we should choose proportional, or when we should choose disproportional, it depends on kind of research problem that we have. That will determine if you use stratified sampling, and proportional or disproportional stratified sampling will be selected. This is an example of stratified random sampling. If you go for proportionate, then we look at percentage. Based on that, we decide how many are going to have. If disproportionate, we choose based on random sampling. Remember, it is a stratified random sampling method. We choose randomly from the strata. It could be proportionate, it could be disproportionate. The next method is known as cluster sampling. It is also known as two-stage sampling. So first of all, we choose a sample of area is chosen, and then second stage, we choose randomly from that chosen area. So cluster sampling is basically used when we have homogeneous units based on geographical contiguity. So divide geographically, make it a cluster, and then we'll choose respondents on random sampling. Say, for example, in Malaysia, we have 13 states. And then I've decided that in my study, I'll only collect data from 4 northern states. And then second stage, then from 4 states, I will use either random sampling method, a systematic sampling, or status sampling to choose the data from each cluster that we have selected. These are the examples of how we can identify cluster. It could be based on states, could be based on towns, could be based on villages. It's a geographical entity that we take into account. It could be one-stage sampling, it could be even two-stage sampling. Now, what's the difference between stratified and cluster sampling? This is a common question that we get from students. How can we differentiate? Because strata is also a strata unit, cluster also a specific unit. It looks to be similar. So the answer is, we use stratified sampling when our strata is internally homogeneous, like male and female. And we choose cluster sampling when clusters are internally heterogeneous. For example, if you choose 4 states for your study, every state inside the populations are heterogeneous, not homogeneous. So this is a very clear-cut demarcation line between stratified sampling and cluster sampling. For stratified sampling, internally population are homogeneous. For cluster sampling, internally the populations are heterogeneous. And this is what I do recommend to many students to use, multi-stage sampling. Use stages in selecting your actual sample of the study. In finance, it's very common. When you select listed companies, you will have certain conditions there. First of all, they should be listed. Number 2, they should be continuously trading for 5 years, for example. After that, they have never been delisted from the stock market. So you have certain stages there, okay? And even also you can choose geographical area. First you decide on randomly select districts in a state, then followed by you randomly select the villages. And from villages you randomly select the houses. And from there you randomly select the population of your sample. So this sampling method seems to be very useful in compared to the other method. But again, it may not be as effective as true random sampling, but it does help solve more of the problems inherent to random sampling. It could be an effective strategy because it banks on multiple randomization. So you have number of stages before selecting population. But then again, multi-stage sampling could be frequently used when a complete list of all members of population do not exist. So the appropriateness of the list of population is not required. Then multi-stage sampling would be very useful. This is another sampling method which is very useful. We call it multi-phase sampling. This is more used in a kind of study where it has to be done stage by stage, phase by phase. Say, for example, if you want to do a study on effectiveness of teaching methods, then you may want to collect data at the beginning of the semester, at the mid-semester, and towards the end of the semesters. Or even if you want to look at the effectiveness of the production process, You may want to look at the beginning of the process, the mid of the process, at the end products that you have. So that's what is called multi-phase sampling. It's totally different from multi-stage sampling. Now, we proceed to non-probability sampling. Remember, we proceed to non-probability sampling when generalization is not really warranted. Then we choose non-probability sampling. And number two, also, when we cannot obtain the list of target population, then we'll go for non-probability sampling. Now, non-probability sampling is a sampling method whereby all target population will not have equal chance to be selected. We'll understand more as we proceed. Non-probability sampling, when you do not need to generalize, your study has limited objectives, specific objectives. You have time and money constraint, and we look at feasibility. If you cannot obtain the list of total target population, then definitely it is non-probability sampling. We start with convenience sampling. Basically, we just use our convenience to select the sample as people stay nearby us, people known to us. So if you're working with the university, I collect data from the university. If I work in a company, I collect data from that company. Or even if I collect data from other companies, I use my own contacts. And through them, I collect the data. So basically, it is convenience sampling. This is same as random sampling in the probability method. In probability sampling, when you sample random sampling, then you must have the list of respondents. When you do not have the list of respondents, then we proceed to convenience sampling. Choose as it is convenient to us because we don't have the list. All right, this is an example, simple example of how convenience sampling works. The second one is called judgment sampling or purposive sampling. If you're not obtaining the list of total population and you have to go for non-probability sampling, then I would say this is the most appropriate one. You go for judgment or purposive sampling. You choose population based on your judgment. Or if you feel that these respondents may fulfill the purpose of my study, so I ask him to fill out the questionnaire. So there's purposive or judgment sampling. It is same as systematic sampling in probability sampling. In a systematic sampling, we have list of respondents, and from there we choose in a system. And here we do not have list of respondents, but we choose using our judgment and looking at the purpose of the study. And then followed by the third one in non-probability sampling, we call it quota sampling. We will put a quota when you choose sample. So when you have list of respondents, in this case, we will go for stratified sampling. But when you do not have the list of respondents, then we go for non-probability sampling, that is quota sampling. So you will restrict certain numbers with the quota to make sure the sample become representative, so that at least I can write my findings in a way that doesn't seem to be generalizing, yet seem to be generalizing the findings on the target population. The fourth one is known as novel sampling, which is also being used by many researchers nowadays. The sampling method or procedure, initially respondents are chosen by probability method, and additional respondents are chosen by using non-probability method. So say, for example, when you are collecting the data from sample population, you use systematic sampling process, and then from their reference, you collect additional data using non-probability method. Panel sampling is another one. Basically, we understand what does it mean by panel. When we have panel, say for example, you are doing a study on leadership attributes and qualities for 21st centuries, then you have to collect data from CEOs of few companies. So we have decided that you will collect data from 10 company CEOs. So those 10 CEOs become your panel of collecting data. And you will meet them few times. Once you meet and collect data, you might go back again and try to get more data. And you go back again. So that's what you call panel sampling. Data comes from a panel. And even we have a new sampling method now. Many people use this, especially studies in marketing may use this, or management even sampling. You collect data while the event takes place. So when an event is taking place, researcher will go there and collect data on the spot. That's what we call event sampling. Now this is how we decide whether should we go for probability or non-probability. If representativeness or generalization is a requirement, then we go for probability sampling. And under probability sampling, if a study is for generalization purpose, then we go for simple random sampling or systematic sampling. Or we go for cluster sampling. If our purpose is assessing differential parameters of subgroup of population, then we'll go for cluster sampling, either proportionate or disproportionate. If our purpose of the study is collecting information in a localized area, then we have to choose area sampling. If our purpose is to gather information from a subset of the population, then we have to choose double sampling. If the representative is not critical for a study, then we choose non-probability sampling. So the list of respondents are not obtained. If the purpose is basically to obtain quick information, then we go for convenience sampling. If your purpose is to obtain information relevant and available only to certain groups, then we might go for judgment sampling, or we go for quota sampling. Now, this is another area of misunderstanding and controversies, that is determining the appropriate sample size. This is a very important step in planning a statistical study, because our data will be analyzed using certain statistical methods. And statistical methods do have requirements of minimum number to be analyzed. So a study must be having an adequate size and which is relative to the goal of the study. The undersized study is a waste of resources because you can't really generalize the findings. And even oversized study uses more resources than the necessary. So oversized study also not really required. If 300 data gives you the true reflection of whole population, why should you collect 1,000? Okay, so this is a table given by Christian Morgan. And based on his table, as we refer, many of you always refer to that. If you have more than 100,000 population, target population, so minimum sample size required is 384. And same goes to massacran. If you see here, if you have 75,000, you need 384. But as you have more than 100,000, then 384 is enough to conclude this study. So now, if you require 384, how many questionnaires are you going to distribute? Definitely not 384. You will never get back all questionnaires that you distribute for data collection. So it depends on the country in question. If your country, the response rate of collection of questionnaire is 20%, meaning that if you distribute 100, you collect back only 20. Then to collect 100 questionnaire, fill in, you have to distribute 500 questionnaires. If the response rate is 50% and your sample size is 300, say for example, then you have to distribute 600. So that's how it goes. You have to go back to your country, and to some extent, you have to go back to a specific industry or the target population to decide how many questionnaires should you be distributing in order to make sure you have minimum sample size required. Now, as I said at the beginning of the talk, if you collect 500 questionnaire fill-in, the minimum sample size 384, what should you do? Should you throw the rest of the questionnaire? No, use them all. Because this is minimum, 384 is minimum. If you have more than that, it's fine. Now what happens when you have less than that? You have to distribute some more questionnaire. Make sure you obtain the minimum numbers. There are other methods also beside Christian Morgan and Omar Sakaran. This is another, danielshopper.com. You can use this one online to determine your sample size. You can even use Daniel Sims one, which is also available online. You can search Google and you will get it. They will also give you the sample size required for your study. And this is what is very popular now, G-Power. I'm not going to show you in detail how can you use it. I'll quickly go through the slide. But I must say here that recently we all use PLS rather than SPSS for management and marketing studies. If you are using PLS, then it's appropriate that you use G-Power because G-Power gives you a smaller sample size compared to Christian Morgan and Umar Sakaran. So you'll always argue the reason you use PLA is because sample size is small. Then you can use definitely G-Power. This is one of the very effective methods. Will give you a smaller sample size compared to Umar Sakaran and Christian Morgan. These are the few slides that I have quickly to show you how we use G-Power. When you go to Google and find out G-Power and you go into it, you will have to follow these stages. You must know which ones to select from the beginning up to the end of the process. And at the end, it gives you the total sample population that is required for your study. So I have tried to explain in a very simple way the concept of sampling, the sampling process, the differences between probability and non-probability sampling. And I have also described all sampling methods available under probability and non-probability sampling and the requirements for you to be able to use probability or non-probability sampling. And at the end also I have explained how do you determine the appropriate sample size for your study. I strongly believe that this video is going to be very useful and hopefully you will have the right sampling method selected and the appropriate size of sample is determined after listening to the video. Wish you all the best. Thank you very much.